James Whitaker was a retired English teacher living in a quiet neighborhood in Boise, Idaho. At 72, he had gray hair combed neatly to the side, wore crisp plaid shirts tucked into jeans, and carried a demeanor of calm wisdom. But behind his calm exterior was a mind trained by decades of observing people, patterns, and personal pain. Life had taught James many things, but his most powerful lesson came late in life, learning to be cold, not heartless but quiet, measured, and guarded, especially when certain questions were asked. James wasn't always this way. In his earlier years, he was the guy everyone called Mr. Open Book. He shared stories at every family barbecue, offered advice to anyone who asked, even when they didn't, and treated honesty like a virtue that should never be watered down. For a while this approach worked. He had a circle of friends, a wife named Karen, and 2 grown children, Michelle and Brad. They all appreciated his warmth and openness. But life, as it often does, eventually changed things. It began after Karen passed away from a stroke when James was 65. Her death wasn't just a loss, it was a shattering. Friends who once called every weekend suddenly didn't know what to say. Some disappeared completely. At the funeral, people asked him questions like, "How are you holding up?" Or, "Do you think you'll remarry?" James had tried to answer honestly. "I'm lonely," he had told a neighbor once. The neighbor responded with a dismissive, "You'll be fine. Everyone loses someone." That moment stuck with him. As time went on, James realized that not everyone asked questions because they cared. Sometimes people asked simply to pry, gossip, or feel better about their own lives. A painful shift occurred the day his own son, Brad, asked him how much money he had in retirement. "You don't have to give it to me," Brad had said, "but I just want to know the number." James chuckled at first, thinking it was a joke. But Brad wasn't smiling. That night, James sat by the fireplace alone and thought long and hard about boundaries, dignity, and emotional survival in old age. From that point forward, he adopted a new philosophy: be cold when necessary. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about protecting what was left of his peace. He decided there were certain questions he would never answer again, no matter who asked. They were subtle, often masked as concern or curiosity, but each one had the potential to chip away at his dignity, his privacy, or his emotional safety. One such question was, "How much money do you have left?" He heard this more often than he'd expected. Sometimes from relatives, sometimes from casual acquaintances, even from strangers at the community center. His answer became simple and firm: "I'm comfortable, thank you." If they pressed, he would smile politely and redirect the conversation. In his heart, he knew sharing his finances would only invite either pity, envy, or manipulation. None of those had a place in his final chapters. Another was, "Don't you get lonely?" That question seemed harmless, even caring. But James had come to understand that loneliness in old age wasn't a condition that needed to be dissected by others. It was something you made peace with or learned to live around. When people asked, he'd simply respond, "I enjoy my solitude." To him, this was an act of power. It kept his internal world safe from judgment and allowed him to choose when and how to share. Then came the third question. "Do you regret not doing more with your life?" That one stung the most. James had worked hard, loved his wife deeply, raised 2 children, taught hundreds of students, and volunteered at the library every winter. Yet society, especially in the age of social media, often made older folks feel like their life should have been some kind of epic, headline-making adventure. When asked this, James would respond with a calm smile and say, "I lived the life that was mine to live." He didn't owe anyone a breakdown of his dreams or disappointments. The fourth question was more subtle. "What are you going to do now that you're alone?" At first glance, it sounded like curiosity. But to James, it was a reminder that the world often didn't know how to value people once they no longer worked, raised children, or contributed economically. His response was always something simple, yet firm. "I still wake up every morning with purpose. That's enough for me." The last question, the one that James found most toxic, was, "Who are you leaving everything to?" That question never came from a place of love. Came from entitlement, from expectation, sometimes even greed. Whether it came from family or outsiders, James refused to answer it. "That's between me and my attorney," he'd say with a polite smile. It wasn't meant to offend. It was meant to protect. By drawing these boundaries, James began to notice something unexpected. The more he became cold in the right ways, the more peace he experienced. The nosy neighbors stopped asking, the relatives backed off, and the fake friends stopped calling. In their place, a smaller, more genuine circle emerged. One day at the library, he met a woman named Evelyn who ran the senior writing workshop. She never asked about his past, his finances, or his loneliness. Instead, she asked about the books he liked to read, what music he played on his record player, and if he wanted to co-teach a poetry session. Their friendship grew, not from intrusive curiosity, but from quiet respect. Evelyn was also widowed and had her own version of coldness, graceful silence in the face of nosy questions. Together, they created a sanctuary of honesty, only shared when it was earned. James' children eventually adjusted to the new boundaries. At first, Michelle had been offended when he gently declined to talk about his will. "It's not about the money, Dad. It's just about being prepared." But he had looked her in the eyes and said, "Being prepared includes trusting people to let go when the time comes. You'll be okay, and that's what matters." Over time, she understood. Brad, still working through his own financial issues, had less contact, but James made peace with that too. He realized that part of growing older meant letting go of people's reactions. There was one afternoon when a young man at the community park struck up a conversation with James. The man, maybe in his early 30s, asked James if he had any life advice. James paused, studied the man, then answered carefully. "Learn to speak less. Observe more. Don't answer questions that don't serve your peace. You're not obligated to open every door in your mind just because someone knocks." The man nodded, a little confused but intrigued. James smiled and continued walking. As time went on, James became a quiet legend in the neighborhood. Not the loudest, not the most social, but the one people respected. He never raised his voice, never argued, but his presence was solid, like an oak tree that had learned when to bend and when to stand still. People often mistook his coldness for aloofness. But those who knew him closely understood it was something else. It was wisdom clothed in boundaries. On his 75th birthday, a small group of genuine friends, including Evelyn, came to celebrate. There was no grand party, no champagne fountains, just coffee, carrot cake, and classical music playing softly in the background. Someone asked if he had any birthday wishes. James looked around the room and said, "Just this. A quiet room, kind faces, and no questions I don't want to answer." The group laughed.